Okay, Karen?
Mm-hmm. There we go.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Hesse, and I lead the Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our speakers, our invited guests from government and academia, to our Democrats Abroad members, and to all of you who have joined this call from around the world. And a special shout out for those of you joining us from those more challenging time zones, clutching your coffee cup. Democrats Abroad rocking around the clock like we always do. So we welcome you to today's forum, Resetting the U.S. Agenda for Women's Economic Empowerment. We're especially honored today to have Senator Kirsten Gillibrand with us, along with a distinguished panel of experts who will put the spotlight on a range of issues that are important to all members, and especially to women. A return to democratic leadership has created a window of opportunity to reimagine and reset U.S. policy in a way that leads to a more equitable society for women and girls. If we act jointly and swiftly, major changes are possible. We're resetting the agenda, and we welcome you to this discussion. Every issue in our Democrats Abroad 2020 platform, from environmental justice to wage equality to education, documents systemic inequities that shut women out of economically and keep them away from tables of power. But our platform also provides some hope, citing policy recommendations within each issue area to address these inequities. The Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative was launched to help focus our attention on this common thread and address the urgent need to lift up women's economic security and leadership as a central piece of all the work that we do. Pat White, DA France, and Carol Moore from DA UK have led this effort. Together, they bring years of experience in philanthropy, finance, social work, and social policy. They'll tell you more about how you can get involved later in the program. We begin today with Senator Gillibrand, who has kindly agreed to say a few words and take our questions. If you have questions for the Senator, you're welcome to type them into the Q&A box. We won't get to all your questions today, but we would like you to type them in because we do want to know what you have on your mind. So following the Senator's remarks, I'll introduce our panel of experts who will highlight several issues from the platform and discuss their implications for women's economic security. Finally, we'll be inviting everyone on our call today to join breakout discussions with our experts at the end of the program. We thank our esteemed speakers and all our attendees for joining us today and look forward to a stimulating discussion. Now I'd like to hand off to our DA International Chair, Candace Kirsten, who will introduce the Senator. Candace?
Thank you, Anne, and good morning, Senator. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is the junior senator from New York, a lawyer first elected to Congress in 2006, representing New York's 20th Congressional District in the Hudson Valley. She was appointed by Governor Patterson to fill Hillary Clinton's seat in 2009 and decisively won her Senate races in 2012 and again in 2018. She currently sits on the Senate Armed Services and Agricultural Committees and is a member of the Senate Women's Caucus. The senator is an outspoken advocate of women's rights to advance reproductive justice, affordable childcare, and an equitable recovery for women in the workplace with national paid leave and equal pay. For years, she has led the campaign in Congress to reform the military justice system and is on the verge of success with bipartisan support for her military justice bill. We are honored to have Senator Gillibrand speak to us today as we explore how to reset the U.S. agenda for women's empowerment. Senator, good morning and thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Candace. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you, Anne, for your hard work, and to everyone participating today. And thanks to Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus. You guys really do make a difference and keep everyone engaged and understanding how important our democracy is. Over the past 15 months, people around the world have really struggled. It's been a tough year and a half. People have lost their health, their income, loved ones, and everyone was touched with severe loss. And most people have also been touched with severe economic anxiety. And women have felt that in an outsized way. The American Rescue Plan was designed to alleviate some of that suffering. Right now, it's getting critical relief to communities and families across our country. The $1,400 relief checks and the expanded child tax credits are basically a lifeline for families struggling to make ends meet. And I'm proud that it included some pieces of legislation that I worked on and pushed for. One was having a national health force, and this would be to train new workers in the healthcare field to help with vaccine distribution, testing, contact tracing, more resources to put food on the table for families that are suffering and unable to pay their bills. We've seen in New York, for example, the food banks have been really overwhelmed during this last year and a half. So whether you were in New York City and lines went around the block, or you're in upstate New York and cars went on for miles, you really saw families in need of basic resources. And so we put money in there for that. We also made sure there was money for small businesses, a lot of restaurants, concert venues, places that really couldn't open in the same way, really needed relief. And we made sure there was money for state and local governments, which was important because they're the ones who are paying the frontline workers, such as hospital workers and teachers. So the American Rescue Plan was basically triage. It was the greatest need as quickly as possible to do the most good. Women during this last year and a half really did get particularly hit hard. Women lost 5.4 million jobs during the pandemic, and that's undone 3 decades of progress towards women's equality. We know 2 things. One, many of the jobs that were lost were because women didn't have access to childcare. Because schools closed, many parents had to stay home. More often than not, it was the women of the household. Childcare facilities were crippled. Most had to close because parents stopped sending their children, but they didn't have resources for PPE or spreading out kids or facilities. In New York, before the pandemic, there was 1 slot for every 4 kids that needed childcare. Today, there's 1 slot for every 8 kids that need childcare. So that was a huge structural problem. And then the second reason a lot of women lost jobs was just because the industries they worked in were some of the hardest hit ones. And the second important thing we have to recognize is that the economy will not recover if we don't allow women to get back to work. And that's why there's been a big focus on the care economy overall. So we can't rebuild the middle class until we acknowledge that the vast majority of families rely on women's full economic participation. We have to remove the barriers that keep too many women from work, particularly women of color. And it keeps them not only from work, but reaching their full potential. So we need affordable, accessible, quality childcare and caregiving. We need universal pre-K, and we need a national paid leave plan. So I was really excited when President Biden included these elements in his American Families Plan. He supports my paid leave legislation, the Family Act. He supports it in a way to not be an earned benefit, but to pay for it through other form of tax. But it's the same principles and the same framework. If we had had universal paid leave before the pandemic, a lot of people wouldn't have had to leave their jobs because they could have taken leave, been home with their kids while the schools were closed, and gone back to work as soon as that resolved. But we don't have it. I think only about 12% of our workforce have access to paid leave. And that's woefully inadequate, given that we're the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have paid leave. So that's got to be one of our goals when we go to these negotiations about what does infrastructure look like. We need to invest in these human infrastructure programs just as much as we need to invest in traditional infrastructure like roads, bridges, sewers, broadband, high-speed rail. And we have to look at ways to rebuild the entire framework of the economy, because that's what infrastructure is. So that's why I'm committed to both sides. I have a lot of really big ideas about how to build the hard infrastructure, and then I have ideas about how to rebuild the care economy. So one of the ideas for hard infrastructure that I think would make a big difference is a bill I worked on with the Urban League called Build Local, Hire Local. And this essentially says that there's a lot of infrastructure in my state, for example, that's desperately needed to be rebuilt. A lot of highways, bridges, sewer systems. We desperately want and need high-speed rail. Rural broadband is critical and still lacking in lots of places. I'm in the Adirondacks right now, and there's not a lot of rural broadband up here. I'm lucky I have it for today. But the thing is that when we built our infrastructure in New York, it was really around the turn of the century. And people like Robert Moses had grand designs about how to build infrastructure for the masses. But unfortunately, those designs often excluded communities of color and low-income communities and often harmed those communities. So for example, if you look at the Bronx, all the highways crisscross all across the Bronx. It's not surprising that the Bronx has the highest asthma rate for children. If you go to Buffalo, there's a highway system that goes straight through the Black neighborhoods and cuts it in half. And so we have a plan now to rebuild that through the communities, so a local grid model. Similar infrastructure problems in Rochester and Syracuse and Albany. And each one, we have ideas about how to rebuild it now that these highways have finished their useful life and they need to be rebuilt, to build it back differently, build it back in a way that unites communities and doesn't disproportionately harm low income and communities of color. And the second thing of build local, hire local is that when you hire people to do the work, you're going to hire local people to do that work as a way to build more communities of color to have access to those jobs, skilled workforce training through apprenticeship programs, through a lot of our building and construction trade unions, and make sure they're the ones who are actually rebuilding the infrastructure in their community. So that's a piece that we're trying to get in the bill. In terms of the care economy, we want to have a universal pre-K to make sure that whole year is in early childhood education, to have much more investment in affordable daycare, to make sure it actually pays for how much daycare costs, with caps on how much of your income you have to pay. We have a cap at 7% of your income. And then a national paid leave plan. And that bill would be an income up to $4,000 a month for 3 months, approximately 66% of your wages for average workers. And then we're debating how to pay for it. I wanted to do an earned benefit, just like Social Security. So you put in 0.2% of your income for an average worker. It's about $2 a week, matched by your employer. $2 a week for your employer, that's only $104 a year per employee. That's affordable. So we liked that plan, but President Biden promised no middle-class tax raises, and even an earned benefit people would consider that to be a tax. So we'll pay for it a different way, but the bill that we're trying to get in is that. In addition to focusing on the economic recovery, I've been focused on a couple of bills to help our service members and our veterans. Right now, you know that I'm in the middle of this fight about military sexual assault. Last year, the year before, the Department of Defense estimated there were 20,000 sexual assaults in the military, and about 150 ended in conviction. So you can imagine how little faith men and women in the services have that justice is possible. Most cases don't go forward to trial. Only about 7,000 are actually reported. Most don't go forward to trial. And for those that do, about 64% are retaliated against for going forward with their case. So the system is broken. The good news is that Secretary Austin, first SecDef ever, has come out and said he wants to take sexual assault out of the chain of command and give it to trained military prosecutors. That's a great first step. Our bill is to draw a bright line around all felonies because we have an issue with women in particular, but military sexual assault. But we also have an issue with racial bias, where if you're a Black or brown service member, you're going to be disproportionately punished, whether it's through court-martial or through non-judicial punishment. And so we really have been urged by experts in military justice that bright lines are always better and that we want to have one system of justice for everyone. And I agree. So we're trying to get a bright line at all felonies, all taken out of the chain of command, given to trained military prosecutors. President Biden believes in that. And so now we're just trying to convince a few more Democrats, such as Jack Reed, to allow a vote on this issue, up or down, because I already have 66 co-sponsors in the Senate. So I will win if I get a vote. And they just introduced the same bill in the House, and it already has 150 co-sponsors, and it will get many, many more. So this bill is a bill whose time has come. The second thing I'm working on is burn pits legislation. A lot of service members who served in the war on terror were exposed to horrible toxins because in these countries, we just dug burn pits and threw all garbage into them, including electronics, building materials, waste, everything, and lit it on fire with jet fuel. And that's the same cocktail that our 9/11 first responders were exposed to. And so the type of diseases that they have are the types of diseases these veterans have. And young veterans in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are dying of terrible cancers that they would never, ever have for this exposure. This is also something President Biden believes in. He believes that his son, Beau, was affected by these burn pits and is perhaps the cause of his brain cancer, which is a typical cancer caused by the toxins that were emitted at burn pits. So that's another bill that I'm hoping we get a vote on this year and we can actually pass. So it's been a very, very intense and exciting time in Washington with a lot of opportunity to get good work done. And I'm 100% committed to getting these measures and many others done in the next year and a half. So I'm happy to answer your questions.
Okay, wow. We are fully aware of how many different really important projects you have right now. And so it's very difficult to choose which questions to focus on because you're involved in so many important things. But our very first question we'd like to ask you, of course, about this economic recovery that is on everybody's mind. And we're very happy with President Biden's infrastructure and jobs bill and this new approach where that's non-traditional, where he goes beyond the regular definition of infrastructure and includes overlooked groups. But my question, now that the president has apparently struck a deal with Republicans, are you concerned that the human infrastructure aspects of this original bill are being sacrificed in the spirit of bipartisanship? And are you confident that perhaps passing additional pieces of legislation through reconciliation will be enough to protect that caregiver economy, combat climate change, and deliver the real help to American women who've borne the greatest burden throughout this pandemic?
Well, the good news for anyone who supports the full picture of economic recovery is that neither Senator Schumer nor Speaker Pelosi will allow a vote on the bipartisan bill if there is no agreement on the reconciliation bill. So we will not sacrifice the entire care economy to have a very small, narrow, hard infrastructure bill. The benefit of allowing the moderates and Republicans to negotiate on a targeted infrastructure bill is to give the moderates and the Democratic caucus a chance to show what they can do and where bipartisanship lies. But that is not going to be at the expense of what the American people elected us to do, which is to get the entire economy back up and running, not just for white males who work in construction. So we will be making sure everyone who wants to be back working and providing for their families is able to, and that's why the definition of infrastructure is as structural as it should be. It's what does it take to get people back to work? That's the infrastructure of our economy, and that includes both hard infrastructure and this care economy piece. So I don't think we have to, we will not sacrifice the care economy for hard infrastructure because neither Senator Schumer nor Speaker Pelosi will accept that. And so hopefully this opportunity to do bipartisanship will guarantee the votes of our moderates to be able to be with us in that reconciliation vote.
I hope so. You have a particular skill at working bipartisan arrangements, as we've noticed on other things. For example, the military work that you're doing. Candace, do you have a question on that for her? For the senator?
I do. Thank you, Anne. And thank you, Senator, for speaking to us today and for all of your action on sexual assault in the military. It's really encouraging to see how the bill is progressing. And I wanted to let you know we here at Democrats Abroad are fully behind that. Our leaders just had a global meeting in May where we unanimously passed a resolution in support of your critical military justice improvement and increased prevention act. The Women's Caucus has had a call to action for quite some time asking our members to contact their legislators about this. And recently we're also suggesting that members reach out to the Armed Services Committee and urge them to pass the bill and get that to a full vote in the Senate. I wanted to ask you today, are there other things that you would suggest we do? What can we do to help finally bring real justice to victims of gender-based violence in the military?
So I do think being heard is always your best, your greatest power and your best skill is to let elected leaders know how much you care about this issue, because that's worked. The work that Dems Abroad has already done over the last 8 years, there's many senators who routinely go abroad and meet with you, and some of them are now on our bill and weren't before. And I dare say it's because they heard from many of you over and over and over again about how important this is. For example, Tim Kaine, who's a big fan of Dems Abroad, was not with us the last few years, but this year said enough is enough. The reforms that we've put in place aren't working yet. And, we did have a very striking report out of Fort Hood that after Vanessa Guillen's murder, they investigated, and that report showed that the command climate at Fort Hood was so toxic that it was permissive for sexual assault and harassment. And that's a pretty shocking thing. And that report is why Joni Ernst, only Republican female former commander in the Senate, decided to side with us. It's also why Tim Kaine, Angus King, Mark Warner, and John Tester all decided this year to support reform. So speaking out is the thing that they remember, because they've talked to you before and they hear from you saying, this is important to me. I would urge you to continue that advocacy. This battle is not over. The DOD is still dead set against us. They have retreated finally to, okay, we'll take out sexual assault, but we don't want one crime taken out. And I'll give you an example of why. Vanessa Guillen was murdered. And when her family went to the Army and said she was being harassed, they denied that. They said, no, that's not true. We have no evidence of that. And they fought the family for months. Finally, when they went to the press and elevated her story, they conceded that she was being harassed, but they intended to cover up the harassment to make it something else. And that's why certainly sexual harassment and murder need to be treated the same, because many sexual harassment cases or sexual assault cases may well end in murder, and then they will try to cover up those links. We want to make sure someone like Vanessa Guillen's case is given to a special prosecutor to make sure that justice is done. And so that's why we have to stay strong at the bright line of all felonies.
Mm-hmm. And we're aware that in our host countries, our allies are already ahead a little bit.
They've already done it. UK, Israel, Germany, Netherlands, and Australia all have taken serious crimes out of the chain of command and have done it over the last 40 years. They've done it for defendants' rights, and they do it specifically because a commander today picks judge, jury, prosecutor, and defense counsel. And so if he thinks you're guilty, you're likely to go to jail for as long as he wants you to. And in the UK, for example, it was a murder trial, and the government agreed that defendant had no chance for justice. So we believe that if you do the bright line of felonies, you will protect defendants' rights for all these serious crimes, but specifically on sexual assault, you'll have a more professionalized system that will be more likely to result in more cases going to prosecution and more cases ending in conviction.
Mm-hmm. Senator, do we have time for 2 more questions or just one? 2 more? Okay. Candace, do you have a question on reproductive justice?
I do. We wanted to jump over to another piece of legislation, looking at the Women's Health Protection Act. Do you have any hope that the Senate will pass that? And how would you, again, recommend, is there any specific action to stop really the anti-choice legislation that we're seeing both at the state and federal levels?
So the Women's Health Protection Act would establish a federal statutory right for patients to obtain and providers to deliver abortion services free from medically unnecessary restrictions that aren't generally applicable to the practice of medicine. So I think that to get this vote passed, we would have to have filibuster reform. We do not have 60 votes right now to get this. If we have any Republicans, it's probably 2 or 3. We might have Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and maybe one other. So this is one of the issues that if we want to protect reproductive rights, you would have to convince Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema that we need filibuster reform. I don't think we have a chance of getting a yes vote on that for at least another 6 to 9 months. I think both Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin would have to fail in getting bipartisan support for things that they care about a few times before they're willing to say, let's just take this opportunity to govern, because this might be the only opportunity we have for a long time.
Yeah, and that, of course, leads us to our final question, which is, in fact, the elephant in the room, if I can say that. We know that I think all of us realize that passing voting rights legislation is part of this. It's the key to having success in all the other things that we want to do going forward. And in fact, the key to passing that legislation comes down to that particular F word, filibuster, that you mentioned. So we're here, you have an audience of hundreds of people all around the world in 100 different countries. And we want to know, how can we help you from all our far-flung locations in working on getting rid of this filibuster? What would you have us do? Because we're ready.
So again, the thing about convincing a senator to be with you on something, more often than not, it just takes time. And I believe that some of these reforms are so important. Our democracy is worth it. Voting rights and statehood for DC is worth it. Ending gun violence and passing a universal background check bill, or passing my anti-gun trafficking bill, or banning assault weapons, that's worth it. Making sure our environment is protected and really attacking global climate change is worth it. So I would do all these things if I could quickly, and I would do it through filibuster reform. I think several moderates aren't there, and it's probably not limited to just Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema. So I think what we have to do is keep moving forward, do what we can on a bipartisan basis, and really convince them that these other measures are really worth it. And we will be harmed when we're in the minority. A lot of the things that we care about will be attacked and maybe successfully overturned. But that's why advocacy is the most important thing we can do. Taking the time to really write letters, to speak out, to talk to your senators and Congress members when you are in the states, using your voice as voters. I think that does truly matter. And keep working on winning the majority. We've got some really good candidates running for the Senate. Reverend Warnock and Reverend Kelly, Reverend Warnock and Senator Kelly are two extraordinary candidates. I think they can win the re-elections. We will have opportunities in North Carolina and Ohio and Pennsylvania. They will likely have primaries, but already some of the candidates that are running sound fantastic. So we'll have our nominees in those 3 states, and we'll run hard there. We want to protect purple states. So we want to make sure Maggie Hassan stays elected in New Hampshire. And I guess Michael Bennet in Colorado. I guess those would be our 2 purple states. But I believe in those candidates. So I think we can hold the Senate, and the House will depend on how much we get done. The House is very sensitive to how voters are feeling and how the economy is going. So passing this reconciliation bill is probably the most important thing we can do to hold the House, because people need to know that Congress is working for them. So being active politically matters, and speaking out matters. And I would urge you to keep doing the same so that we can eventually get a vote on filibuster that perhaps could be successful.
Okay, thank you. Well, having you come and join us is part of our effort to get the word out to a huge audience around the world. So we know you have to run, but we are so grateful and thankful that you've given us a little bit of your valuable time, because it really does cheer us up and keep us moving. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Anne. I appreciate you all, and I appreciate the chance to get to talk to you. And I hope I get to see you in your home countries of Europe at some point when I'm coming to France and England and other places, hopefully in the next 9 months.
Thank you. We're always happy to have you. The doormat is always, the door is always open. So thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah. And as she was just mentioning, really us showing up in 2022 is going to be critical to keeping the majorities that we do have and even adding to them, which, as we know, is so important. If you're tuning in and you're not yet a member of Democrats Abroad, I'd invite you to go to democratsabroad.org/join, where you can join us today and get regular updates on voting through 2022. And back to you.
Okay, well, after that really inspiring little talk there, I feel so good. And now it's time to move on to our panelists. But first, I want to take one moment and acknowledge those of you who are just logging on now and joining us on Facebook Live. So we welcome you again to our Global Women's Caucus Forum, Resetting the U.S. Agenda for Women's Economic Empowerment. And now I'm very proud to introduce our 4 guests who will highlight several of the issues from the DA platform that we've just mentioned and discuss their implications for women's economic security and help us understand what's exactly at stake. After each of our guests has shared their brief remarks, we'll transition to breakout rooms to continue the discussion and dig deeper on some of the topics we've touched on and explore next steps. So today, we'll look at how women and especially marginalized groups of women fare in 3 areas of our platform: economic policy, gender equality, and social welfare. Each of these issues has serious implications for women's economic security. Any combination of them, which is usually the case, leads to disproportionately even worse economic hardship. So we'll begin our discussion by looking at the interconnected nature of these issues as they apply to groups based on race, class, and gender to create these systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Through the framework of intersectionality, we're better able to understand the differences among us and advocate for policy remedies that achieve equity for all women. As I introduce each of our panelists, we'll be dropping links into the chat box that will lead you to more information about our guests and their many publications. So, our first panelist to provide the framework on intersectionality is Dr. Rhonda Zelezny-Green, the Chief Learning Officer at BRK Ujima, an anti-racism training and consulting organization working to reimagine diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. She has over 15 years of professional experience across multiple continents and sectors. Dr. Zelezny-Green, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you everybody. Let me get the slides pulled up. All right, so welcome, and I want to thank Senator Gillibrand for what was a rousing talk for me. Being selected to follow Kirsten in this incredible lineup of women, who all hold doctorates, by the way, is such an honor, and I want to take a second to acknowledge this space and this special moment. Today, I'm going to talk about intersectionality and its importance to and relevance for women's equality and economic empowerment. It is fitting that Senator Gillibrand opened this session and included remarks about the importance of infrastructure, and particularly broadband infrastructure. My own work frequently examines the gender digital divide, and I'd like to highlight findings from the World Wide Web Foundation at the start of the pandemic that found that men are 21% more likely to be online than women. So imagine how that statistic has affected women's economic opportunities during the pandemic when everything suddenly went online or digital overnight. On December 5th, 2018, Senator Gillibrand also tweeted, "Our future is female, intersectional, empowered by our belief in one another, and we're just getting started." And on that note, I'm gonna get started. Ooh, okay, can you still see? All right, there we go. Great. So at a time when critical race theory is being banned from instruction in educational institutions across the United States, It feels particularly poignant to be invited here to speak with you and about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Intersectionality, a term first originated by lawyer, activist, and scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, is an intellectual extension of critical race theory. Critical race theory examines the ways in which law and society can be structurally and intrinsically racist, as opposed to being merely influenced by racist ideologies. Intersectionality then broadens this thinking to explore how various elements of our identities can impact our lives, with race among several elements to be considered. Intersectionality can be understood as the way several different identities that an individual embodies come together or intersect to influence their lives. These codependent identities are lived in social, societal, and related systems that invariably subject the individual to different levels of oppression, domination, discrimination, or privilege, dependent upon the biological, social, and cultural factors that shape their identities. That was a mouthful, right? Well, life is complicated, and to understand how and why economic factors affect the fight for women's equality, a theory that can encompass this complexity is required. To connect the dots to understand why intersectionality matters in the fight for women's equality, Crenshaw sees intersectional feminism as, and I quote, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. When viewed in this manner, we can see that, as Crenshaw further notes, all inequality is not created equal. Moreover, inequality is not just a contemporary phenomenon either. Historical circumstances undoubtedly come to bear on what happens to women today. Often, economic exclusion is multi-generational, occurring over decades or even hundreds of years, particularly in the case of Black and Native American women. For example, according to the 2021 first quarter report on the usual weekly earnings of wage and salary workers released in April by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, Black women's median earnings were $768, or 84.2% of those for white women, which are at $912. And earnings for Hispanic women were $696, or 76.3% of those for white women. Viewed from another identity axis, white women earned 81.6% as much as their male counterparts, compared with 92.1% for Black women when compared to Black men, 80.5% for Asian women when compared to Asian men, and 88.3% for Hispanic women when compared to Hispanic men. But let me repeat that inequality is not created equal, since in either of these scenarios, Black and Hispanic women are subjected to concurrent forms of oppression linked to their racial and gender identities, as well as being located within the United States labor force. In the case of white women, they too experience economic inequality in terms of the gender pay gap. However, even with the gender pay gap, they still significantly out-earn Black and Hispanic women. I'm certain my colleagues, Drs. Mason, Scott, and Badgett, will make further illuminating contributions related to women's economic status, but this is just a taste of what we see and know from an intersectional perspective. All of this leads to my next point. We cannot view the fight for women's equality as simply being just about women. It is imperative to acknowledge that women embody multiple identities that bring oppressive issues to their doorstep: race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, class, ability, sexual orientation, gender expression, education level, religion, caste, and on and on. The next time you hear someone say, "Why does everything always have to be about race?" Or, "It's the economy, stupid," you can say, "No, it's all of the above." One thing to bear in mind is that intersectionality is not the gateway to enacting the oppression Olympics. In other words, just using intersectionality to see who has it worse than someone else. Rather, intersectionality is an analytical framework to understand how one's identities can combine to produce distinct experiences, some of which may prevent women from enjoying their full human rights. I will close by sharing an image adapted by Sylvia Duckworth that for me really connected the dots for why we must embrace Crenshaw's intersectionality if we want to achieve women's equality, economic or otherwise. In this wheel of power or privilege, we can see that on the outer rims, the identities that are more oppressed are present, while as you move closer to the center, you find the identities that are least oppressed or more privileged or more powerful. Of course, every single identity is not represented in this graphic, but you can at least begin to get a sense of how economic power or privilege can be shaped by other identities, frequently steeped in the context of history, time, and place. In today's culture wars, there are people who would like for you to forget about gender, to forget about race and ethnicity, to forget about wealth, and to believe that everyone has equality of opportunity, no matter who they are or where they come from. Please don't fall for this simplistic trap, lest you become a tool of oppression for other people yourself. Understanding this is where allyship can start. Empathy is where allyship begins. My aim here today was to help make you stop and think in a way that would strain your sinews. And if you enjoyed this talk, I hope you'll join my breakout room later on where we will develop radar charts to understand our own positionalities and what this means for the substantial work that lies ahead. Remember, as the late great Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody's free until everybody's free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zelezny Green. That's an amazing graphic. My goodness, that it's really interesting to see it all put together. And I am excited about learning more in your breakout. Okay, so our next panelist is on economic inequality, and we have with us Dr. Linda Scott, Emeritus Professor at the University of Oxford. She founded and is now Senior Advisor to the Global Business Coalition for Women's Economic Empowerment. Dr. Scott works with international corporations and global NGOs designing and testing programs to better include women in the world economy. She's the author of The XX Economy, which I have, which documents the historic pattern of restrictions on women's economic liberty across the globe. A great book. Dr. Scott joined us in April already for a powerful discussion of her findings, and we welcome her return. Dr. Scott, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Anne. I do want to open by saying that I have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. And that some people will want to know a little bit more, in particular to know the evidence behind some of the stuff I'm going to say. And so I want to be sure and reemphasize, and thank you so much, Anne, for the shout out, that I have a book out from 2020 called The XX Economy, and everything I talk about here is covered in that book as well. What that book is based on is recent data that demonstrates that women around the world, including in the United States, suffer from what might be called a full circle or 360-degree economic inequality. It's not just about employment, though we usually tend to focus on that, but also about capital and market access, credit, small business, education, and a range of other economic aspects. So a lot of what I'm trying to do in talks like this is to try to convince women, particularly American women, to start thinking of themselves as an economic power that is a fully fleshed economy. It is also important to understand, and I document in this book, is that the gender system, the system that enforces women's economic inequality, is a structural economic factor. It is not random. It is not generated by free choice. It is certainly not deserved, and it is not justifiable in any way. I also try to emphasize that there is a strong relationship between economic liberties and all other freedoms. It is not something that we can afford to dismiss as something less important or unsavory. In the United States, as elsewhere in the world, gender is also the largest segment and most dramatic axis of inequality. The system affects half the populace. In the United States, half the voters. All minority and disadvantaged groups are half female. Inequality for gender affects households and not just individual women by reducing their income and assets and increasing insecurity. So this is a very big, widespread issue. It is not something that is isolated. It is not something that does not affect anybody besides women or particular advantaged women. It's important to understand that at this point in time, American women especially make a significant economic contribution to the United States. Women currently generate 40% of American GDP. They own 33% of small businesses. They make 85% of the consumer purchase decisions, and they are 51% of the labor force. In other words, the women of the United States, if they were to choose to form their own nation, would have an economy, immediately have an economy that would be able to join the G7 because it would be big enough. In fact, it would be the second largest economy in the G7. What that means then is it's just too late, I'm sorry, to send women back to the kitchen. It's too late in terms of the sociology, but it is also too late for the American economy. If someone were able to rapture women back into the kitchen in America, the American economy would immediately become scorched earth. It would be nothing but rubble, and it would probably never recover. There is no reason at this point for women to be going hat in hand to politicians and to institutions asking for equal economic treatment. Similarly, however, it is not possible to solve their problems without attending to unique gender constraints. These must be addressed directly so that, for example, if you have a campaign that says, let's hire locally, or we need to have infrastructure, these campaigns need to have specific provisions to make sure that women benefit as much as men by, for example, reserving certain percentage of jobs for them. If you don't do this, we've learned through research that you will simply replicate gender inequalities in everything you do. Because of the strength of women in the economy, it is also simply an absurd economic approach to be planning the recovery from the pandemic without attending to these gender issues. You are doomed to failure if you are ignoring what is essentially half the American economy. So it's time to demand their due, I think. Women and their cause is not an isolated, narrow, left-wing issue, but it is a mainstream issue. And all the research shows that Americans support gender equality across the board, men and women. So what I'm going to do now is to talk to you about 4 specific matters. The actions by the Roberts Court that have affected employment rights for women, small businesses post-pandemic, student debt, and childcare. These are just a few. And then I'm going to end each time by showing you how one might address them and showing you that, in fact, this is something that the global group of women in Democrats abroad could actually take action on. First of all, the Roberts Court. It is crucial to understand that the Roberts Court has significantly weakened the ability to enforce women's equal rights in employment already. There is a threat, I recognize, to reproductive issues, and those are very important, but they have already substantially taken the teeth out of women's ability to enforce equal rights in the workplace. They've done this 2 ways. One is by upholding forced arbitration, which is a practice by which employers force employees to sign away their rights to sue, and by refusing to declare women a class for the purpose of class actions. It is crucial to pay attention to what they've done here. It essentially negates the rights that were won in the 1970s. Research shows that when the Western nations all had the same problem here, because back in the 70s, they left enforcement to individual women to take up and to bear the risks on their own backs. Those risks are considerable. There is no reason for it to have been done this way. The recommendations for the research is to take enforcement away from the judicial system entirely. It is fundamentally the wrong place to be enforcing equal rights. And it could be done in the US by appointing an agency similar to the US, similar to the IRS. In the interim, we may want to consider very seriously the idea of packing the court. This is not the kind of formal structural change I personally normally advocate, but from women's point of view at this point, it is probably something that needs to be done. Student debt. Student debt is actually a women's issue. Why? Because two-thirds of debt is held by women. And the reason that it's held by women is because they have to have more qualifications than men in order to get the same jobs. They are also paid back at 20% lower pay on average, and therefore they rack up more interest costs. These loans are predatory. They should not be treated as a handout. They should be treated as the government going back and cleaning up something they should never have done. It's important to understand also that student debt has massive negative economic consequences, and that the US economy would benefit actually by wiping it out. It burdens the millennial generation in particular even more than they have already been burdened. It should not be treated as a one-time expense, but as an investment in the future health of the economy. It is not an elite matter. Rich people don't let their children take out predatory loans like this. Instead, it is something that affects most of the millennials, for example. It has been a crime against an entire generation. It specifically holds back women's advancement because they are the most exposed, and it is not an issue where we should be simply assisting the poor. It needs to be wiped clean for everyone, and new student debt should have vastly different structure. Then small businesses. Women own a third of small businesses, but they get less than 5% of conventional business loans. That's because the so-called objective standards that the banks use, in fact, systematically discriminate against women. An example of why this is a problem currently is that the pandemic loans, for example, that were awarded by the Trump administration went through the banks, which probably means that women got even less than the 5% they would normally get. And so there needs to be special attention to women's needs in small businesses. For example, the fact that they disproportionately own things like daycares and household services that are essential to all women's economic well-being. The pandemic requirements squeeze very hard on women's small businesses, and these things need to be rectified, especially if childcare capacity is to be maintained in the future rather than lost entirely. Childcare. Childcare is the biggest barrier for women across the board and across the world, and it affects even those who do not have children because it is so frequently used as an excuse to discriminate against all women. I can't emphasize enough that this is a much more important and impactful issue than parental leave and should be prioritized over it. We should have learned from the pandemic that childcare needs to be completely repositioned as economic infrastructure. With this big of a segment of the economy affected by it, it should be treated like investment in airports or highways. You would not build a highway system and then only allow the poor to use it. And it would be the same with building a childcare system. As we know right now, in fact, a childcare system that would be a universal system will actually pay for itself. We know this because otherwise it causes limited female labor force participation, which is a major force for growth. It also crucial to the future of human capital, and should be executed similar to the public school system and should provide universal, affordable, high quality childcare. It should not in any case be left to the private sector, because if you do that, it will be spotty and it will replicate inequality. It also should be evaluated as an investment and not as an expense, a kind of luxury handout for women who should be at home like God intended them to do. And I can't emphasize enough that it would pay for itself. I also want to propose an action. It's been my observation that the impact of protests and strikes, especially for women and especially at this point, are extremely limited. And we need a new kind of action to be taken in order to enforce women's demands. The idea that I have come up with in the book, I have called the 80% Christmas. It would apply to all the holidays in the holiday season, obviously. It's important to understand that holiday spending is crucial to the American economy and to most economies around the world. Most consumer purchases occur at this time, and the economy cannot survive without healthy spending at that time. The effect is not just on retailers or toy manufacturers, but ripples out across all industries. It is also time specific. Losses during the Christmas season cannot be recovered in subsequent months. As they say, Christmas only comes once a year. You only have one time to make those sales. Importantly, Christmas spending, holiday spending, is utterly controlled by women. This is the part of the economy where women rule. So if they were to mount a campaign where they pledge to reduce spending by 80%, that is the proportion of the gender pay gap, 80% over their previous year's spending, and to keep doing it every year until reforms are made or holiday retail disappears. This is something that everyone can do. It's not just limited to working women. It's not just limited to the rich. It's something we all can afford to reduce our holiday spending, every one of us, and it's relatively easy to do. If you look at your Christmas budget, you can probably see many places where you could cut back on your spending. It's private. Nobody can punish you for it. Nobody can retaliate against you because you're doing it for the most part in front of your computer screen and clicking with your credit card. But it's not something everyone has to do. If a significant number of American women started to do this, it would be something that would have an impact, and it would be something that would gather attention. It's something that would show up, the impact would show up and be announced automatically because the press covers retail sales in the weeks leading up to Christmas. It's easily executed through social media, much like the Women's March in 2017, and it can be affected by global Democrats and women around the world through social media. It's also potentially fun and could be funny. You can imagine people posting, for example, on TikTok or on YouTube or on Facebook, videos of themselves finding ways to cut back for Christmas. It also is something that could be done in a focused way, allowing people to be able to, power structures to be able to respond. Because yes, it is true, this is something that would work and it would hurt. I would argue that nothing is going to work unless it has the potential to hurt. But it can be pulled back if the power structures are responsive. So for example, in the case of forced arbitration, this is something that has bipartisan support in Congress to get rid of it. It could be done before Thanksgiving in time for everybody to have their wallet open for Black Friday. I argue for this because I think it's new, it's fresh, it's a 21st century form of activism. And while the soft influence that we often talk about is important to maintain, I personally think that it's time for women to reach for a sledgehammer instead. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, I love this idea and I'm in. And how about if everybody who wants to get in on the 80-20 Christmas plan, type it into the chat box. I'm in. We'll see how many of our attendees are in on it too. So I think it's a great idea, Dr. Scott. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the other ideas. I don't want to be raptured back to the kitchen either. So I'm going to take our power and use it. So, all right, we'll talk about that more in the breakout session with Dr. Scott. And now I'd like to introduce our third panelist on the issue of social welfare, and that's Dr. C. Nicole Mason, who is in fact joining us from one of those very challenging time zones. She's in Hawaii. So thank you for your dedication to be here with us. I hope you have enough coffee. She is president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, a leading voice on pay equity, economic policies, and research impacting women. For the past 2 decades, she has spearheaded research on issues relating to poverty, entitlement reform, and political participation among women and communities of color. Last year, Dr. Mason coined the term she-cession to describe the disproportionate economic impact of COVID-19 on women. Dr. Mason, thank you for being with us today.
Very excited to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I want to start out just by echoing something that Linda said, and it's the fact that women are the economy, and when women dropped out of the economy or were forced to exit the workforce, we saw the impact of women's departure on the economy. So in terms of thinking about there's a direct connection between women's engagement in the labor force and the workforce and the social safety net. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So as you know, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on working women and their families and has triggered an economic recession that will have a lasting impact on women's long-term labor force participation, economic well-being, and wealth. It has also exacerbated and deepened many of the existing inequalities and disparities, health, income, racial, and exposed many of our failing systems that were not working for many women and families. And when we think about the devastation and the exposure of the broken healthcare system, the broken childcare system, it also exposed a really weak social safety net. So for the last 3 decades, the social safety net since 1996, with the passage of the Welfare Reform Act in the United States, the social safety net has been eroding, and there's not been a lot of attention paid to rebuilding it. And in moments of economic crisis, and I want to say that what happened in 2020 with the pandemic will happen again. We will have another economic downturn. But what made it more devastating or more impactful, especially for women and women of color, is that there was no social safety net for them to tap into. Right now, currently, less than 3% of Americans receive any kind of cash assistance. And so when we're talking about the social safety net, we're talking about a bundle of programs meant to make sure that people have a basic floor. And in the United States, that floor is virtually non-existent. So when the pandemic hit, there were very few programs for people to tap into. And we were looking at a very bureaucratic system that made even people who were people who had income at the beginning of the pandemic that went from income to zero, they had trouble tapping into it because of many of the regulatory issues like asset limits, not asset limits and other provisions that prevent people from tapping into resources very quickly. So when we started to study and think about, again, the social safety net and what we might do to build a more just, equitable economy and recovery, rebuilding the social safety net was one of those issues. And I want to talk about just 3 or 4 ways that we look and think about building the social safety net in the United States. The first is expanding unemployment insurance. So many of the issues, many of the things that we said were impossible before the pandemic and couldn't be done, as a result of the pandemic, we are doing them. So universal basic income in the form of direct payments to individuals and families, we said could not be done and it was logistically impossible. But during the pandemic, we found a way to make it happen. We also found a way to figure out how to expand unemployment insurance to make sure that more people were eligible. I'm hoping that post-pandemic we'll be able to make some of those changes permanent, and also figure out, I'm advocating for a universal basic income. And we've seen that it works, and when people have it, it goes directly to covering their basic needs and necessities. The other thing that would go a long way to rebuilding the social safety net is a child care tax credit, expanding the child care tax credit and making it refundable. We're seeing that, we're doing that now, but that's only in place for a couple of years. But we know that it has the expanded child care tax credit right now has the ability to lift more than half of the children living in poverty, lift children out of poverty. The other thing that I want to talk about is the universal child care. So there are a lot of proposals on the table for child care, but the US spends less than 1% of its GDP on family and child care policies. And so the floor is really low. We're only below Turkey and Ireland, only above Turkey and Ireland. And we know that if women had labor force participation, workforce participation, and at rates similar to Norway that does have a subsidized child care plan, we would add $16.9 billion to the economy, and probably much more in indirect benefits, economic benefits. So in the US, there have been proposals around expanding, universal child care beginning at pre-K. We are advocating for, at IWPR, and I think many other advocates across the country, child care beginning at 0, and going from 0 to, 0 to 16, or until there's no need for care. Parents feel like there's no need for care, and also removing income limits and making it available to all who need it, which is the case in many countries. And so the government does have a role to play in making sure that families have high quality, affordable childcare. And as Senator Gillibrand pointed out, there's still so much tremendous need. So again, that is when we talk about increasing the social safety net and expanding it, childcare is a critical piece of that. And the legislation that's being proposed right now, no family spends more than 7% of their income on care. But I also advocate making childcare, framing it as a public good rather than a private obligation of families. Again, so that we can again, especially in this moment, help women to not only re-enter the workforce, but sustain employment. And the other social safety net programs, SNAP, Social Security, TANF, public or subsidized housing, WIC. This is an opportunity. I believe we have a once in a generation opportunity to strengthen those programs, invest in them, especially programs like TANF specifically, that have been all but stripped in over the last 3 decades, and states have allocated resources or reallocated TANF dollars to other things. And so again, rebuilding the social safety net, because we know, again, that economic recessions, we had one in 2008, we have one in 2020. And I do believe that if we, in the interim before the next economic downturn, we can invest in the social safety net, rebuild many of these programs that we've been talking about, we will ensure that the next economic downturn, women, families are not struggling to make ends meet. And we also, I think we're either going to either pay now and with the investments, or we're going to pay later. And that's what we saw during the pandemic. We infused trillions of dollars into the economy because we did not have a robust social safety net. And the last thing I'll say is that when we think about intersectionality and who's disproportionately impacted by the lack of social safety net, it's women of color, and it's also children. And so if we can really, again, because women are half the economy, and we know that when women don't have programs, especially those who cannot return to work immediately, there is a need for these programs and for them to be easily accessible, and for families to be able to tap into them, when there is need. So I'll stop there.
Okay, my goodness, thank you so much for that. That is, you're full of ideas, and it's really exciting to hear your comments and what can happen. And I'm looking forward to hearing more and having a conversation with you in the breakout session. So thank you, Dr. Mason. Now, our final panelist for today gives us an opportunity to take a deeper dive into the issue of economic inequality for people who are systemic disadvantaged based on sexual orientation. It also is an opportunity to join with our global LGBTQ+ caucus in acknowledging Pride Month, which is celebrated each year in June. Our panelist, Dr. M.V. Lee Badgett, is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a distinguished scholar at the Williams Institute for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Law and Public Policy at UCLA School of Law. Her research focuses on economic inequality for LGBT people, including wage gaps, employment discrimination, and poverty. Her books on LGBT economic issues have debunked the myth of gay affluence and have shown that same-sex marriage is good for society. She has been a consultant and a speaker on LGBT issues on the world stage. So thank you, Dr. Badgett, for joining us. The stage is yours now.
Great, thank you so much. This has been an incredible morning for me anyway, and I've really enjoyed listening to everyone's contributions. It is an exciting moment, I think, to think about how we can turn what has happened to our world through the pandemic, but into much longer term meaningful change for everybody. And so I'm gonna actually stick to that theme. And I am grateful that Dr. Leslie Green raised the issue. Everybody, nobody's free till everybody's free. And I think we've learned this over and over again in the pandemic. And I want to make a similar kind of argument for looking at issues related to being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. We don't always think about these issues from an economic perspective, but as you just heard, I'm an economist. That's what you're going to get from me as well. I want to also kind of make the case that what we see, the disadvantages at the individual level add up to holding back our economy. So I think that's a common theme to what other folks have been saying. Let me just say this starts very early in the lives of LGBT young people. We know that in the United States and actually around the world, this is really an appropriate thing to raise for Democrats living abroad. In every country that's been studying, bullying is very common against LGBT young people. Discrimination by teachers in schools is very common. And those have consequences for the kind of education that young people get. They are more likely to drop out. They're less likely to attend school when they're bullied, as LGBT young people or in other sources of bullying as well. They are less likely to continue on in their education to achieve the level that they're capable of. This has consequences, obviously, for the young people themselves, who bear an enormous cost that often comes out in terms of mental health. But it also means that they're not able to get the kind of knowledge and skills to develop and enhance their creativity through our school systems that are essential, not just for them, but really for all of us in terms of the resources that our economy has to draw on, our human capital, as we say in economics, that those characteristics that, that keep on giving, that we don't lose when we use some of that skills and knowledge, we have it the next day as well. That's why we call it human capital. That's an odd phrase, I recognize, for non-economists. So the education system is not kind of fully incorporating the capabilities and enhancing the capabilities of LGBT young people. And in fact, I would just say at this moment in the United States, the education system is the site of enormous attacks, especially against transgender young people. I think the opponents of LGBT equality have finally realized that they've lost that battle in many ways in the larger society when it comes to marriage equality and looking at sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. But they think that transgender people are still vulnerable, and politically that is absolutely true. So we're seeing much proposed legislation that would limit the rights of transgender young people in our schools in many ways, and it's something that I think we really have to have at the top of our policy agendas. So all of that is going to hurt those young people, but it's also going to hurt our economy as a whole. The kind of mental health complications that arise from facing discrimination, from living in a world that stigmatizes who you are, is something that hurts not just young people, but LGBT adults as well. We now have enormous quantities of research that show that there are disparities in mental and physical health complications, issues, diseases that are particularly hurtful for LGBT people, like higher rates of depression and anxiety, higher rates of thinking about suicide, higher rates of violence, higher rates of substance use, higher rates than heterosexual and cisgender people of HIV. So we have a lot of evidence that the kind of stigma LGBT people face all over the world, but in the US as well, makes people sick, makes people sicker. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then if we also, so that's also a kind of human capital that we bring to our economy. If we're not in good health, as we have learned, it's very hard to have a fully functioning economy. Once people get to the labor market in the workforce, people have to deal with the reality of potential discrimination. And about 1 in 5 LGBT people has experienced that kind of unfair treatment in the labor force. We know that people who are, we know from experiments that people who are open about being LGBT are very much discriminated against by employers in the application process. So just one study showed that just to get a single job interview, heterosexual men needed to apply for about 9 jobs, whereas gay men needed to apply for 14 jobs, just to kind of give a sense for the, and when we look at transgender discrimination, the rates of discrimination are even higher. This has consequences for wages, not surprisingly, just as it does for when we look at women and people of color. We have a wage gap for gay and bisexual men compared to heterosexual men that has not actually gone away. It's not actually even gone down during the last couple of decades at a time when we think we've made enormous strides forward, but we haven't seen that in that wage gap. Lesbian and bisexual women often appear in our surveys to have some kind of advantage over heterosexual women. They earn more. We think that that's a couple of things going on there. One is that that's largely an advantage, so to speak, for white women. When we look at racial differences within LGBT people in terms of economics, we see that that white LGBT people actually do out-earn people of color who are LGBT kind of across the board. And sometimes that wage gap is also there for people of color who are LGBT compared to cisgender heterosexual people of color. So we're learning more about intersectionality, but we have, kind of a clear example in my mind of exactly what several people have been talking about in terms of how these identities layer on top of each other to create economic disadvantage. So I want to argue that that all of these disadvantages come together to also reflect not just hardships for individual people, but for our economy as a whole. We're losing out when we discriminate in the workforce. We're losing out because of health disparities, and we're losing out because of the educational system that is pulling back what LGBT people have to contribute to the economy. And at a time when we're trying to dig ourselves out of a very deep recession in the US and globally, we can't afford to leave those resources behind. And it's when we think about this from the pandemic perspective, it's actually pretty clear that if you had most of the statistics that I have in the book that I wrote about this issue, the economic case for LGBT equality, of course, predate the pandemic. But what they show is that going into the pandemic, that LGBT people were already highly vulnerable, both in terms of their health and having health disparities that would make them more vulnerable than average to COVID, both in terms of their economic status, where they have fewer resources and bigger challenges in some ways than many other people do. That we saw those play out in the COVID epidemic. I wish I could tell you, what those stats look like on the health side. But again, we are still in a developmental process for getting good data on LGBT people. And this pandemic showed exactly where we're missing it. We were completely left out of all of the tracking systems. A couple of states said they were going to add that to their data collection, and we have yet to see any data on this. But we do have some data on the economic status of LGBT people in the pandemic that was collected through some private surveys. Since the government wasn't doing it, some organizations took that on, and there's several different ones, and they all tell very much the same story. LGBT people were much more hard hit by many measures than were cisgender heterosexual people. They were more likely to be furloughed. They lost more job hours. They had higher levels of financial distress. They had higher levels of food insecurity. They were hit very hard. And then when we have been able to drill down again to kind of assess who within this, what's a very broad group when we talk about LGBT people, some subgroups were hurt much more, and that would be transgender people in particular, and again, people of color who are LGBT. So they all showed in these same surveys much higher rates of financial distress as a result of the pandemic. So we have a lot in common. We all have to work together if we are going to make us all free, clearly, and get us not just back to where we were before the pandemic started, which was obviously an unequal position, but to move us all up towards equality and to raise everybody's economic status, making the pie bigger by having a more inclusive economy. The good news is we know we can do some things about this. Sitting in the Senate waiting for a vote is the Equality Act that would clearly state that LGBT people need to have equal access, legally speaking, of protections against discrimination in housing, credit, education, public accommodation, strengthening the protections already there for employment, and juries and programs that are federally funded. There are all sorts of ways that we need to shore up the principle of non-discrimination and give us that tool to go out and fight inequality. I think we can do more. I think we can do a lot more than this, as people have talked about many programs that will, of course, help LGBT people just as they help many other people. A lot of LGBT parents, families that struggle in exactly the same ways that the folks speaking earlier have talked about. And there will be many other ways that we should be talking about how we're going to make sure that if we get there, if we get all of those wonderful policies in place, to make sure that they are fully inclusive for everyone. So I think it's exciting, as I said, to be here and to start thinking about how we're going to be investing, not just in the programs we've already talked about, but ensuring that there's inclusion for everybody. So I'm excited to be part of that discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Badgett. Also wonderful ideas. And I'd like you to know that my colleague, Martha McDevitt-Pugh, who leads the LGBTQ plus Global Caucus for Democrats Abroad, has been quite active on the Equality Act. And she and I are always trying to cook up ideas where our two caucuses can work together. And there are really a lot of things that we can do, a lot of activism that I'd like to get involved in. So now, everybody, oh, hold on one second. Yeah. Now comes the fun part. I hope everybody is full of ideas and bubbling over with questions that they'd like to ask. And I hope you've thought about which of these wonderful expert breakout sessions you'd like to attend. But now, time to pay attention. We'll ask you all to join our breakout sessions by clicking on the Zoom link that you'll see in the chat box. And then you'll select the topic breakout room of your choice. If you can't access the chat box, check your email. If you RSVP'd for this event, you should have just received an email with that fresh Zoom link, breakout link. So you can also scan the QR code you see on the screen, I think, if it's there, or simply type the link address into your browser. And then when you've joined the new meeting, you can either choose your own room or our host will help you find your way to the discussion group with the panelist of your choice. And that's the hard part, deciding where to spend your time, I think. So here in the breakout room, you'll have the opportunity to hear more from the panelists, ask questions, and please make recommendations for next steps by the Women's Caucus. We want to hear your ideas. That's what this is about. The discussions will be led by our facilitators, all of whom are DA members, DA leaders with knowledge of the topic. The facilitators, their topic, and panelists are as follows. Carol Moore, who has co-created the DA Global Women's Caucus Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, her idea, will be in the breakout room on intersectionality with Dr. Zelezny Green. Katie Brand, who leads the France Women's Caucus, will help out in the breakout on economic inequality with Dr. Scott. Pat White, also one of the brilliant originators of the DA Global Women's Caucus, Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, will assist in the breakout on social welfare with Dr. Mason. And Martha McDevitt-Pugh, who is our representative to the Democrats Abroad representative to the DNC and co-chair of the Global LGBT Caucus, will be assisting Dr. Badgett in the LGBT Economic Equality breakout room. So we'll see you there. Candace? Do you have a comment?
Wow, Anne, that's a tough choice.
Where are we gonna go?
No, I want to echo what someone just wrote in the box. Thank you. This was really extremely powerful panel. And to all of our speakers, thank you for your insightful presentations. Looking forward to talking about them more. Also want to extend my thanks to you, Anne, and to the Global Women's Caucus and all of the sponsors listed here on the screen for organizing this event. And last but not least, to our back-end communications teams who are making this transition happen. And on this note, I do have to make a donation pitch. We are an entirely volunteer-run and primarily donation-funded organization. So we do rely on your donations to keep our work going. I'll pop the link here in the chat box to our donation page. If you are able to contribute any amount, really, that'll help us do our work and continue putting on great events like these. So thank you for your generosity, and we will see you over in the other Zoom meeting.